Welcome to Broadband Breakfast live online for Wednesday, November 22nd, 2023. We're coming up on the end of the year, of course, and so we got to remember that date. Very excited to welcome you to one of our regular Broadband Breakfast live online editions. We're going to be talking about ChatGPT, the future of artificial intelligence. Huge week in AI that none of us could. I don't even think the head of OpenAI could have foreseen even a week ago when and beyond when we planned this out. We do this event every Wednesday and hope to continue that. We may take a holiday break late December, but we aren't taking one today, and we're glad we're not, because this is a very important and timely topic, and we've got three experts to talk about the future of OpenAI with us here that I will introduce shortly. Before I do, I just wanted to welcome those of you who are new to our weekly Broadband Breakfast Live Online, and those of you who have been here before. You kind of know the drill. We talk about better broadband, better lives. That's our motto at Broadband Breakfast. And we focus on the infrastructure that makes high-capacity internet possible, but also on the applications, uses, and the big tech environment in which we operate, with concerns about privacy, social media, free speech, and now increasingly artificial intelligence. And so we're going to kind of we will get help assessing the threat, if there is any, big and small, from artificial intelligence. And we will talk, of course, about what's happened to our lives, our work lives, even our personal lives, in terms of our use of technology over the past year. I'd love to get our panelists' thoughts on how they are using ChatGPT or competitors like Anthropic or Bard or many others, I'm sure. So before we get into that, I want to just remind everyone that next week in our regular Broadband Breakfast Live Online session, we're going to be talking about a very important topic. It's kind of bubbled up in recent weeks, digital discrimination and the FCC's digital discrimination order. I put in the chat link for our Zoom followers, and we welcome others as well to go to broadbandbreakfast.com/BBLO, which expands to this page that you see now. And this shows all of our upcoming events. The week after next week, we're going to be in person with the special event called Digital Infrastructure Investment Summit. This is actually the fifth summit we've had. It's going to be at Clydes of Gallery Place on Tuesday, December 5th. You can register for $245 to attend breakfast and lunch, and there will also be a registration option for sign up. And then the day after, we'll be talking about the top broadband stories of 2023, the week after, the Affordable Connectivity Fund at the year's end, and the 20th of December on space wars and some of the controversies in satellite broadband. And I also want to give a thanks and shout out to the sponsors of Broadband Breakfast that allow us to do this free programming every Wednesday at noon Eastern Time. Our sponsors include Utopia Fiber, Broadband.Money, Comcast, DCS Technologies, Nokia Broadband Toolkit, Google Fiber, Broadband Now, Michael Baker International, Positron Access, and the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Thank you to each of our sponsors for their support. Let's now change our view and introduce each of our panelists. I am very, very happy to welcome to our discussion here today three experts in this topic of AI. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they will speak. We're going to hear first from Robert Clapperton, who is Associate Professor at the Creative School, and the Creative School is at Toronto Metropolitan University. I keep hearing about Toronto and AI, so we have to kind of get a level set on what is it up there in Canada that causes this AI knowledge. Robert specializes in computational linguistics with an emphasis on the critical application of natural language processing, understanding in education. So very, very excited to kind of hear your insights, Robert. He's also the co-founder of Ametros Learning, a natural language understanding learning platform. So thanks for taking the time to join us. Next up will be Camille Crittenden, PhD, and she is the Executive Director of Citrus and the Banatao Institute, and co-founder of the Citrus Policy Lab and the EDGE in Tech Initiative. EDGE stands for Expanding Diversity and Gender Equity. And this is at the University of California. I'll let you speak a little bit more about Citrus, Banatao, EDGE, and other aspects. But she is the chair of the California Blockchain Working Group in 2019-2020, and also co-chaired the Student Experience Subcommittee of UC's Presidential Working Group on Artificial Intelligence. And big news, there's a big report out of California just yesterday on AI. So thanks for bringing that to our attention, Camille. That is on the link to the page. It is linked from the page, but I'll put all these in the chat stream as well on Zoom. And then batting cleanup will be Adam Tier. Adam is senior fellow for the Technology Innovation Team at the R Street Institute. And R Street is become very, very active in Washington tech policy discussions. I've known Adam for many years. He's had other hats prior to R Street. He spent 12 years as senior fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And before that, he was at the Progress and Freedom Foundation and has worked for other think tanks. I think I got to know Adam when he was at the Cato Institute, and he invited me to contribute to one of his anthologies there on copy fight. So that's going way, way back. But Adam, it's good to have you back, and look forward to your thoughts on permissionless innovation and how they apply to the artificial intelligence debate. So with that, let's go ahead and open it up. Obviously, and I haven't really mentioned anything besides the fact that everyone's been reading our press reports for what's going on at OpenAI. I don't know if any of us have a lot of insight, but it does seem to demonstrate how much attention the large language model technology is when it becomes the most important business story of the last 96 hours, that Sam Altman was fired from OpenAI, and as of today is back at OpenAI with changes in the board composition and the mix. And again, if anyone wants to comment on that, I think we certainly can speak to it, because again, it's a big aspect to what's the attention that everyone's paying to this. So with that, let's go ahead and open up to you, Robert. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts 1 year after the November 30th, 2022 launch of ChatGPT.
Sure. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me. 7 years ago, I founded a company that used natural language to create experiences for students to practice, working with clients, working with managers, and built about 200 of them. But last November, all of a sudden, everything exploded, and I'm getting asked to speak every 2 or 3 times a month to different teaching and learning departments at colleges and universities across Canada, because everything that we've done on the education side in terms of assessment has been pretty much put at huge risk. What's happened is everybody that assigned essays, everybody that assigned case studies, everybody that assigned cases in business school, everything was all of a sudden now we can't tell whether or not students are putting in prompts, and everything that these professors that I've been talking to, and deans of business and deans of liberal arts schools, everything's at risk in terms of academic integrity, but also academic integrity of the institution. So in the last year, I have seen so much progress in schools learning how to try to see if they can detect ChatGPT. And then when I say progress, I mean lack of progress, and that they actually have not been able to combat that. But what I have seen is there's been a real move now to shift how we assess and how we deal with students. And ChatGPT has brought this out. And what I'm seeing is many more of the universities are getting more ready to go back to kind of a dialogue-based kind of assessment, because ChatGPT, and in the product that we make, it allows students to converse with an AI character that is based on OpenAI. We've been working with OpenAI for 2 years in terms of producing the language, but we bound the content and control what can be talked about. But we can do an assessment that ends up being a formative kind of assessment where students are able to converse with this character. And as they are getting assessed on their own knowledge, the characters are filling in the gaps. The characters are keeping track of what they do and don't know. So I'm seeing an unbelievable transformation in how generative AI is going to change how we actually teach and learn, how we actually are able to engage with students. And I'll finish up with just a couple of things I'm seeing in education in that sense. One is I have 120 students in my one class, and I used to know about 20 of them really, really well, and 100 of them I sort of knew on a spectrum from sort of to never have seen them. But now that we're using generative AI to engage with the students on a regular basis, a weekly basis, I have a window into where these students are in terms of their development through the course. And more importantly, the students are getting a sense of what their own intellectual development is as they move through it. It's no longer a matter of where I teach for 3 weeks and then test. This assessment is happening ongoing all the way through the course. So it's making a huge difference. And the last thing is getting students to read nowadays is really, really difficult. But in using this kind of a tool with generative AI, is that the student has to read what the character's saying. And by the time they finish an interaction, they've pretty much done the kind of reading we used to assign in a PDF that was never actually opened. So I'm seeing there's a lot of positive things that are going to come out of generative AI for education. Right now, all the focus is on the negative and the fact that we have a whole cohort of students that are, at risk in terms of their critical thinking skills until universities figure out how to actually engage with them. But I think Gen AI also provides the answer to that. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Let me just ask a quick follow-up, Robert, if I could. So you're focusing on sort of the impact of AI in education, and I heard a lot about this in the first 3, 4, 5 months after ChatGPT's launch. I haven't heard as much about it since then. Is it your sense that people are still trying to kind of, quote, ban or control the use of AI by students? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, is that a chaotic quest, or is there a realistic reason for trying to do that?
I think the banning has pretty much gone out the window. I was speaking to the Associate Dean of Business at Humber College here in Toronto, and they've been told that there would be absolutely no budget for ChatGPT detection software that exists out there, mainly because it's next to impossible to do it. So, and the other thing too is if you ban it, you create all sorts of equity issues with, some students are going to follow it, some students aren't going to follow it. So I think I'd say 99% of the professors I talk to realize it's going to become part of what they do. And some are trying to incorporate it into the process of learning, so making it a stage in what they do. And others are using it in the sense where I'm using it is to sort of create an engagement with the student, using it to do some formative assessment to let the student know where they're at. But it was actually quite quick. When I started speaking about it, it was in January of last year. And I remember the first 2 or 3 talks I gave, most of the reaction was all about how are we going to stop this? How are we going to, prevent them? How are we going to, and within 2 months, everything had shifted to not only are we going to have to use it in how we teach, we're going to have to make sure they know how to use it when they come out of university, because it's going to become part of what they do in their life, in their professional life.
Wonderful. Well, we'll continue this as we get other experts into it, but appreciate you drilling into these aspects. Camille, we look forward to your perspective. Tell us a little bit about Citrus and the organizations you're working with.
Sure. Thank you, Drew. And I just want to plus one to everything that Robert just said. I'm glad that he's here to represent the academic teaching and learning side of the discussion with Gen AI. I think we'll have a lot to talk about on that topic alone, even though I know that there's a lot more to cover as well. So I lead a center at UC Berkeley. CITRIS is a Center for IT Research in the Interest of Society. So we're actually a multi-campus research center based at Berkeley, but with close partnerships at UC Davis, Merced, and Santa Cruz. So the purpose of CITRIS is really to bridge between emerging technology and its positive implications for society. So we have a number of research initiatives around climate and energy, health, aviation, and policy. So as you mentioned, the tech policy side is the CITRIS Policy Lab, which I co-founded and is led by my colleague, Brandy Noneke. So that's really what we do at CITRIS. Within the University of California, I've also been involved, as you mentioned, with the Presidential Working Group on Responsible AI that came out with a report a couple of years ago. And subsequent to that, we established the UC AI Council that is helping to advise the executive leadership on any policies or implementation recommendations for AI tools. So maybe we can talk about institutional governance of AI tools at some point. I think that would fall into that conversation. I am also very interested in applications of AI and emerging technology in the public sector. So you had mentioned my work on the California Blockchain Working Group. Also, we have great interest in broadband. So I'm pleased to be here with friends from the broadband community. We also led a working group at UC on looking at how we could use the institution of the University of California, which, by the way, is the second largest employer in the state and has something like 250, 300,000 students across the UC system. So it's really quite a large institution with a lot of leverage to influence, a variety of things. But hopefully that we can use that power of 10. There are 10 undergraduate campuses, 6 health systems within the UC system, a whole range of natural resource stations where people can do research as well throughout the state. So it has a really broad reach. And we were looking in this broadband case at how can we use that leverage to improve broadband access across the state. So perhaps that's to the side of what we're talking about today with generative AI. But I think there is going to be some conversation, I hope, between the computational demands of generative AI and what that means for the infrastructure, both the broadband as you're trying to get information from one place to another, but also just on the compute resources and the climate implications for that as well, because it's hugely energy intensive. And there are reasons why in some cases, some of these AI platforms will only allow you a certain number of searches or inquiries per day, in part because it does require that large amount of compute resources. So I hope that as we're thinking about responsible innovation, we'll also be thinking about that on the climate and energy side as well. So I'll stop there for the moment, but happy to follow up.
Could I just ask you, since you're probably closest to the California report, do you have any kind of top line analyses from this? I had heard of California Governor Gavin Newsom coming out with something, and lo and behold, yesterday it dropped. What is the kind of scope? How do you view this, particularly in the context of this other series of discussions that Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has been having just down the road, just down Pennsylvania Avenue? So like, what's the state role in I mean, besides the fact that California is where all of the top AI companies are, like what's the kind of role of a state-specific policy on AI, Camille?
Yeah, thank you. I think California, just because we're so large, nearly 40 million people, we have a leadership role to play. And I appreciate Governor Newsom's perspective on that and really engaging academic partners and industry partners to think about how can we use within the state government, which I think is the largest state employer, how can we use generative AI tools responsibly? Because we have a duty to, of course, protect the data and privacy of the citizens for whom we have vast amounts of data. And at the same time, like, are there ways that we can use it to reduce administrative burden, to help create efficiencies? again, in a responsible way. So that's what that report really lays out, is how can the state of California within its own agencies and offices use the AI tools that are now becoming available? What kind of guardrails do we need to set up around using them or not? But we would love to see California lead the way in at least investigating what are the options and possibilities.
Wonderful. Thank you again. And we're going to come back to all these topics. Let's turn to you, Adam. Tell us a little bit about your observations since you started following AI in some detail years ago.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Drew. Good seeing you again. Yeah, so it's been a tumultuous year in the world of technology policy, thanks to the rise of ChatGPT and generative AI and large language models. I've been covering technology policy, as you mentioned, Drew, for a long, long time. In fact, going on 32 years now in DC area doing it. I'm like a piece of the furniture in the tech policy world at this point, just sitting around. And it's been something to see, because I've never seen such an intense interest in fact, a sort of techno panic around a technology in a long, long time. And I mean, I was present back in 1993 at those first video game hearings that Lieberman and others held in the Senate. So I've seen a few techno panics in that, and the crypto wars and so on and so forth. And so it's really kind of remarkable. I mean, even just a year ago, if we were having this event, no one would know who Sam Altman was or who OpenAI was. And then it's really taken the world by storm and captured so much policy interest across the globe. In Washington, and I'll just talk a little bit about the policy implications here of what's happened. You have seen an explosion of interest on Capitol Hill in the Biden administration, and more importantly, at the state and local level, like I've never seen before. Recently, one trade association, the BSA, said that a year-over-year difference between October of last year and October of this year at the state level, they found a 440% increase in legislative activities around artificial intelligence and machine learning. That's astonishing. And so we're not just talking about a patchwork of 50 states interested, we're talking about a lot of localities as well. But at the federal interest, where I spend most of my time, we now have so many bills being floated in Congress and frameworks that it's hard to inventory them all. But the bottom line is that debate has become, I would argue, significantly radicalized in the sense that we're talking about fairly sweeping types of algorithmic and computational controls, new licensing regimes, new agencies, liability schemes, all sorts of other types of regulatory mandates for AI systems. Now, I'm not sure if any of that will move. As we know, Congress is a very dysfunctional place these days, but the Biden administration has taken the driver's seat, and they're moving the ball forward, instructing the agencies to get far more interested in AI policy and really sort of go out there and unilaterally potentially start regulating AI in a variety of ways. Some sensible, some it's not clear if they have the statutory authority to do so. And of course, all of this comes on top of an international scene for AI that is really developing quite rapidly. We saw just last month the AI Safety Summit in the UK. We've seen ongoing developments in many other countries. You know, back in the middle of the summer, we thought we were leading the world again in generative AI with Meta when they released their large language model, Llama, 70 billion parameter model, huge. Less than 2 months later, the government of the UAE announced the release of Falcon 180B, an open source LLM that was 2.5 times larger than Meta's Llama, thus displacing it as the largest open source model in the world. That's just a really good sign of the sort of international competition that the United States faces. You know, the US won the first round of the web wars and digital technology battles with Europe and other nations by having a policy environment that was largely conducive to risk-taking, entrepreneurialism, and what I've called permissionless innovation. But it seems like now we're in for a little bit of a change, maybe a sea change, in fact, of policy approach towards AI and the next generation of computation and computing. So it's worth paying attention to that, because I would argue, and I have in my work, that could undermine the engine of our success and potentially shoot ourselves in the foot as we face really stiff competition internationally from China, UAE, other nations. And we don't want to do that because not just the competitive ramifications of that would be huge, but also the geopolitical security consequences of undermining our computational algorithmic capacity as a nation and our technological base would be devastating, I think. So lots to discuss there. I'll just leave it at that and turn it back to you, Drew.
Great to get the table set on the federal issues, and I really appreciate you bringing up as many of you as you've done there. I'm going to lay out 3 or 4 big picture areas I'd like us to talk about. Okay, one, and I think just good to get this out there. What's your PDoom, right? Okay, that is to say probability of doom. Like again, maybe there's a little teensy bit less discussion of this now, but it was so shocking to see the power. And I think it's from ChatGPT 3.5 to ChatGPT 4. I definitely notice differences in my interactions between the two of them. And so like, let's just get it out there. Like, what, I mean, is it 0? Is it 0.1%? What is your probability that this could go very badly awry for humanity in the next decade or decades? That's one issue. The other is kind of, well, let's talk specific harms, okay? And the biggest one that always just kind of leaps out at me is sort of the issue of privacy and bias, and maybe that's 2 separate issues. But let's talk concretely, like the AI, the Biden administration's AI executive order seems to take some steps in this direction, and it sort of balances what's good and what's bad. But I'd like to kind of go from the highest threat to like the lower level threats or harms that you feel are out there. And then the third big issue I want to kind of put out on the table is the question of computational power. Okay. And we actually did an event, Broadband Breakfast did we called it the Made in America Summit last June. And it was about infrastructure, but also green energy, green investments, and about semiconductors, okay? And this has been alluded to here, the kind of computing power necessary to power these AI models, so much so that there's energy implications, right? Computing implications and chip implications, right? I mean, the GPUs of NVIDIA and others are just kind of driving this and slurping up data. And 90% of these advanced chips are made in Taiwan, right? And so the question is kind of the geopolitical angle to this. And Adam, you've also kind of brought that in. So let's sort of start with those 3 big questions, and let's go in the same order we started with and get your take on them as we think of more questions. And again, we encourage audience questions as well. So Robert, what's your PDoom? We still can't hear you. Sorry, I know you just turned
Sorry
off.
about that. My PDoom, as you put it, I haven't heard that one before, but is pretty connected to the harm aspect of things. I think we're in real danger of a whole cohort, and I'm going to speak back to education because that's where I see the biggest risk of this. I know false misinformation and political interference and everything that you can imagine, language capable and image capable generative AI is going to cause problems in it. But on the education side, we're at risk of an entire cohort, like really having a diminished ability to critical think if we don't act on this really quickly, and how we get away from this idea of students being able to get AI to do the work for them. And this is the hardest thing that we have to try to do on an educational policy level, like in terms of how we work with it, but on a pedagogical level as well. And it's somehow we have to get them to become good at using the tool to make them smarter and to make them learn more effectively. And right now, from what I've seen in the schools that I've visited and dealt with, most that is not happening on the level that it needs to. And that to me is the biggest specific harm we face in terms of generative AI, in terms of having students losing that ability to be able to put an argument together, to be able to, rationally deal with issues, when it's just so easy to put in a prompt and have that issue defined for you, to have that argument made for you. But it's this kind of double-edged thing. I know I'm going on a little bit here, but on one side, we have to teach them how to use that to make their argument better and stronger. And on the other side, somehow have to get them to not just use it as the easy way out. The computational power, I don't really have a lot I can add to that. I think how we use LLMs is going to have to be looked at really carefully. Like using it to make a shopping list or whatever and in terms of and things that are around, personal activities, as opposed to the things where it can really help and drive things forward in society. We're going to have to look at that very carefully, I think. And I don't know, it can't be a matter of policy in that sense, but maybe, almost going the same way where you get people to recycle and things and to think about how they use it.
Interesting comparison there. Great. Thank you. Thank you for taking that broad approach. Camille.
Thank you. I'm also going to hedge a little bit on the PDOOM question and refer to a talk that was held at the Citrus Research Exchange this past fall by Jaron Lanier. Some of your viewers might know him. So when he talked about artificial intelligence, he reminded us all that it's not one thing. It's not a monolithic kind of thing. Their AI is used in all kinds of applications by all kinds of companies and nonprofit organizations. So, speaking about, is there going to be some AI apocalypse? And if we, a few months ago, there was this call for a 6-month moratorium and a moratorium. There are all these, high-level folks who signed on to it. But I think if you actually spoke to them one-on-one, they would say, who's going to stop and how would that be helpful? And would it actually make a difference? And most of them would probably say, no one's going to actually stop the development, and it probably wouldn't be that useful anyway, because AI, it is a double-edged sword. There are folks who can imagine how to use it for quite nefarious purposes, and then there are others where we really need all these advances in AI for all kinds of applications in health and climate, et cetera, and education. So that would be my PDOOM answer. On the specific harms, the thing that I'm really most concerned about right now with generative AI platforms is the ability to generate images. So there's the misinformation and disinformation that can be proliferated on the political side, but I think a far greater use that's already out of hand is non-consensual sexual imagery. So the way that celebrities or your 8th grade friend their face is being pasted onto pornographic images, that's causing real social harm. And there's very little recourse or responsibility being taken by the platforms who the software that enables it, the platforms that host it, the cloud computers that host those files. So I think responsibility or accountability has to come down somewhere, because those are really harmful. So that would be just one example of harms. There are lots of other examples of bias and discrimination, and we can go into that more as well. And then I already referred to the great computational demands for generative AI, and I think you're right that we're going to have to look at the hardware infrastructure to see how we can improve that. And there are certainly researchers who are looking at the chip architecture and trying to make those more energy efficient, so that we can do all this computational processes that in a way that's not as energy intensive as it is right now. But certainly we need to think about that, as Adam was saying too, as a national security interest. And I think through the CHIPS Act, we're trying to invest in that chip making capacity here in the United States, and not to be so reliant on manufacturing from overseas.
Adam.
Yeah, so look, on the PDOOM thing, which is really just better referred to as the sort of existential risk question surrounding algorithmic technologies, things have gotten really out of control, and we're being led around by a lot of people who have Terminator-esque fantasies floating through their head. I mean, dystopian dread is just dripping off of every page of what is being written about AI these days. And in the hearing rooms, we hear crazy scenarios bandied about that are usually influenced directly by science fiction movies, television shows, and books. And we've got to move away from that. That is just really not where we should be focusing our time and attention in terms of AI harms. That is extremely low probability. And of course, we need to consider these issues and concerns in the broad, and we need to think about how to address some of those risks. But it's the day-to-day risks that we already know exist that we need to figure out. I dropped in the chat a link to a piece I did in February where I identified 7 fault lines in AI policy, things that are driving AI policy issues. Starting with privacy and data collection concerns, 2nd, bias and discrimination concerns, 3rd, free speech and disinformation issues, 4th, children's safety concerns, 5th, physical safety or cybersecurity matters, 6th, workforce issues or infrastructure issues, and then 7th, national security and law enforcement concerns. Now, look, those 7 concerns I identified in that paper are really the same 7 concerns we've been fighting about for the last quarter century with regards to the internet and e-commerce and digital policy, right? I mean, it's just AI is an extension of those policy battles. And I've argued in my work, we already have a lot of good things in place to address a lot of these problems. And we need to start with sort of a more bottom-up and flexible and agile approach that it understands that we can build upon existing regulatory frameworks and governance mechanisms, both ex ante and ex post, to address these things before we start to reinvent tech policy whole cloth with grandiose regulatory schemes for sort of like global governmental control of all AI in the name of stopping existential risk. Look, I mean, I do know one thing about what's an existential risk regarding AI. It would be global totalitarian control of all AI by some centralized force. And yet there are people not only proposing that, but the idea of bombing data centers and stopping all computational advances in the name of stopping these hypotheticals. I mean, we absolutely cannot go down that road. Moreover, there's nothing the United States of America could do to stop China, Russia, the UAE, or anybody else from developing their own computational or algorithmic capabilities. And so we can't be engaging in these ridiculous ideas of, pausing AI or global governmental controls. We need to focus on the real problems that we know exist, that we can deal with in a more pragmatic way, using existing governance mechanisms already on the table. So I'll just leave it at that.
We have a great question from Michael Nelson and from others too. I'll get to many of these. Let me ask Michael's question up front here. He says, much of the discussion about AI policy focuses on controlling algorithms and who creates them. Why aren't we devoting at least as much attention to, one, the people who buy the tools and might abuse them, including governments, and 2, the quality of data that is the foundation of AI applications? What are your thoughts on these questions about focusing on the people who buy AI tools?
I certainly can chime in here briefly. I think Mike's exactly right. I think the key principle, I wrote a piece about called the most important principle for AI regulation. And I said, we really need to move the focus away from the debate about sort of the upfront input side of thing and look at the outputs or outcomes side and how AI is being utilized in the real world. That sometimes can include, as Mike's question suggests, looking at who's buying or utilizing these tools. But more concretely, it just means like, look at the actual real world outcomes and outputs of algorithmic processes, right? And identify where the problems were developed. If we get hyper-focused on the input side and like trying to perfect everything out of the gates, well, then no progress is going to happen, because we're going to have to shut down all of these sorts of algorithmic experiments based upon hypothetical worst case scenarios. So I like where Mike's heading with that question. We can find ex post and after the fact remedies and identify these problems as they develop and then come up with more concrete solutions. I think that's the better way to go. And it's the model we've utilized so successfully for the internet for the last quarter century.
I can just chime in for a moment on the procurement, which I think is a place where large institutions like the University of California can play a role to try to nudge industry partners into the right direction, because we are large buyers of the software. And if we can have a set of institutional responsible AI principles that we want to see reflected in the bids that they put in for providing those kinds of tools, then I think that will be encouraging to them to think about from the outset, doing things like auditing and monitoring for safety, red teaming before they put it out, some of the other strategies that have been established. And just to speak to the second question about the data, I think you're really right to point that out and to think about what kind of data are these large language models drawing on. As we know, a lot of the data, say from Wikipedia, also is not representative, say, of the population as a whole. I think something like 10% of the authors of Wikipedia articles are women. So what are we leaving out from that perspective when you're pulling in all of that data? Not to mention copyrighted data, which we haven't talked about much, but there's also that important point about authorship and ownership of intellectual property.
Yeah, in fact, I want to just highlight that for a quick moment. Robert, welcome your comments on this too. But do any of you view any kind of maybe it's the reverse of an existential threat, like a threat that could stop OpenAI from a copyright ruling that this is an infringement to have slurped up all the data for AI. Does anyone have a perspective on these? I mean, these very significant high profile lawsuits, Getty and others have filed these against developers of AI tools.
The one thing I think about in terms of large language models taking and developing texts, I mean, how different that and the idea of intertextuality. I mean, if you're going to write a screenplay as a human being, you're going to read as many screenplays as you possibly can. You're going to develop a style and you're going to produce one. And the large language model going in and kind of doing a similar kind of a thing. So I don't know how much pure copyright things, but on the image side, I think there's definitely a case for that, because that's they're not taking and repurposing, they're not taking screenplays and repurposing the screenplays directly. They're using them as sources, if that makes any sense.
But I would also say that they're taking the author's voice and, identifying those patterns that make it sound the way that it does, and then creating new artifacts based on that authorship. So I think that's sort of at the crux of what the author's legal case is about, that if their works are being used in a way that could be replicated ad infinitum because of the way that these generative programs work, then what does that mean for their own authorship and their own creative ownership of their work?
Adam, I see you just posted something in the chat about the lawsuit, I guess Sarah Silverman's lawsuit. Could you address that, and what are your thoughts about the copyright implications of AI?
Yeah, well, very briefly, Sarah Silverman, on behalf of herself and other artists, I believe, had been filing suit against ChatGPT for training data on her material and other artists' material. It suffered a major setback just yesterday from a federal judge, and I won't go into details. But the bottom line is that it signals that once again, we're going to have another round of the copyright holy wars. And Drew, I think this is where, when we first met, you alluded to this 25 years ago. You were covering this as a young reporter, and I was covering it as an analyst. And, we experienced these generational copyright holy wars about a new emerging technology really disrupting the traditional status quo in a major way. And so I think, we said it back then, and I'll say it again. Systems and models will have to change, and expectations about copyright will have to change. Doesn't mean we throw copyright out. Absolutely not. But we have to understand that technology is going to change the baseline of the discussion we have about what we mean about protecting artistic creativity and giving it legal protections. It just has to be more flexible, or else we're going to have to just start shutting down large language models altogether, because there's just not going to be any easy way to separate all these things out. We're going to have to come up with a more flexible approach.
We've got another question. This is from Charles Baldwin about, in a presidential election year and beyond, how do we protect ourselves from state-sponsored disinformation campaigns? Let's actually just talk about that for a moment. What is the harm from AI? Just like being able to replicate plausibly sounding falsehoods? Let's just tease this out a little bit. What is the harm exactly? Camille, Adam, Robert?
I mean, I think the first order harm is when people try to create images and voice. Now, that technology is quite advanced as well, to make it sound like, Drew, you were saying something that you completely don't believe, but that someone had the technology to be able to make it seem as if that it was coming from your voice. So that can be confusing. Hopefully we're encouraging people to have a level of digital literacy to be able to say, that doesn't sound like something Drew would say. Let's go check some other sources and see if that's actually true. So I think having that kind of video or voice imagery or content out there that can be misleading, confusing, and ultimately damaging. Now, the second order harm, I think, is what they call the liar's dividend, where because all this technology is out there, even if you said something that you didn't like, you could say, well, I didn't really say that. Someone must have manipulated my imagery and made it seem as if I was saying that. You can cast doubt on any kind of video documentation because this technology is available for anyone to use. And we've seen that actually with Trump in the, say, Access Hollywood tape case, where at first he, said, yeah, sure, I said that. And then in a few days later, a week later, said, no, that wasn't me. So you can already have that kind of tension between what can we believe as far as video or photographic documentation or voice documentation goes versus what can we cast doubt on or cast skepticism on because this technology is available.
I want to also bring in the question you raised earlier, Camille, about, I guess, revenge porn, right? I mean, that's really what it is. I mean, is that a concrete harm that can be addressed through a policy mechanism, through lawsuits? What kind of protections? The previous questioner raised Section 230, and the repeal of that, which has been a kind of a goal of advocates for victims of sexual exploitation. What are your thoughts on the intersection of the AI tools and how we deal with revenge porn?
Yeah, that's difficult. And I think revenge porn is very specific to an intimate relationship where one person is taking that person's imagery and making it available.
All right, no, thanks for broadening that out. You're talking about completely fabricated images, right?
Yeah, exactly. Both adult and children. There's a huge proliferation of child sexual abuse material that's available now. And again, you might say, well, it's all computer generated. These aren't real children who are being abused, but there was a source image. So there was an original, person, a human involved. And I think it raises the tolerance for that kind of behavior if you have these millions of images out there already available. So what can we do? I think the platforms themselves can be better about takedown requests. So once that kind of imagery is detected, to take it down. They can also use AI to detect falsified imagery. So within their own systems to try to screen for that and not even allow it to be shown in the first place. So I think internal industry policy could be helpful in trying to address some of these harms. Now, I would also say that some of the hosting, like document hosting platforms like Box or Dropbox, a lot of these images are being shared through those platforms. And so it's not just the social media companies that we need to be paying attention to, but also some of these other document storage companies and what are their policies, what are their takedown policies that we could work with them to make it less available.
Adam, what are your thoughts on addressing this issue?
Well, I think if Congress was smart, they would take a more narrow focus on this particular concern, which we know exists already today, even before the rise of generative AI tools. Revenge porn and these other types of deception issues are been very serious problems. And we have a lot of legislative proposals floating right now to address this. And in a better, smarter legislative arena, we would be focused on these concrete harms and figure out how to handle them now, right? Instead, they get bundled into these grandiose debates where we have to have 50-page frameworks with, everything in the kitchen sink approach to AI policy. That's just not the way to get things done. This Congress, let's remember, for the last 15 years, we've been promised a federal baseline privacy bill. Nothing happened still. We've been promised for the last 6 years, federal driverless car legislation. Not even reintroduced this session. Right? I could go on down the list. I used to bet all my students at the university when I worked there, like, name me any tech policy bill that you think is going to pass for sure this session of Congress, and I'll take the opposite money. I never lost a single bet, unfortunately, for those students. And the reality is that that's going to happen on AI unless we get more concrete and say, like, here's a specific problem, like revenge porn, whether it's with AI or anything else, that should be actionable. So we'll add to our regulatory toolkit in that. I will also say, however, on the broader concerns about deception, disinformation, so on, we do have some existing regulatory infrastructure to deal with some of these matters. It's a question of enforcement. And like, how do we get people to actually enforce laws that already exist, either torts or other types of things, and then maybe figure out how we supplement them from there on an as-needed basis.
Robert, we've gotten a number of questions, education-focused questions. Shelley Warren has raised them about, do you see education changing to follow with student progress rather than age? Also the role of trade schools. And I'm wondering if you could speak to or address the questions about, let's just specifically focus on, how do you use ChatGPT? You talked about this in your opening statement, to kind of what does that mean? To talk to us, how does it help you to like learn more about your students, and how do you envision kind of students using this in a positive way?
Sure. One of the big things, one of the dreams that technology and education has always been to come up with this adaptive way of teaching, this way of personalizing learning. And large language models are probably the closest to being able to do that. So the way that I use it is to create a knowledge base that informs the large language model so we can control what it says. And the learner engages with a character in a dialogue. And through that dialogue, the learner demonstrates where they have gaps and where they don't understand concepts to the level that you want them to understand. And you can have the character reinforce the gaps. You can have the character fill in the gaps, and you can make it so that you can identify where a student is weak, so that you can act on it at that time. Because right now, I mean, if we wait to a test, and the biggest problem is not so much me seeing a student struggling, it's the students don't know themselves that they're struggling in the system that we've taught in for so long. In the way that where you go to 4 or 5, 6 lectures before there's any sort of assessment to see where the student is. And the reason we didn't have that kind of processing intervention is you can't do it logistically. You can't do it budgetarily. You can't have a TA that's available to talk to every student. But generative AI, if it's done correctly, can provide that intervention where the student knows where they're not doing well and where I see it.
Another question, maybe impose on you for another moment, Robert. David Colquhoun, or Colquhoun, I apologize, says, I have tried asking ChatGPT questions about which there is genuine scientific uncertainty, and he says that the responses are hopelessly bad. I'd actually like everyone's take on this. What is your concrete experience? Do you have the kind of, wow, this is incredible, or do you kind of like, there's all kinds of problems with this? I mean, because I'm kind of more on the wow side, but I can understand as you get into it, there are definite problems, and I guess let's hear from everyone on this particular point about how well the large language models are doing.
Sure, I can start. I mean, since OpenAI has created this place where you can create your own GPT on a subject, I mean, it's terrible, because the only way you can use generative AI in an educational setting is if you can completely bound what the knowledge is that's being talked about, but you've also developed the ability to determine what the learner's saying. There's all sorts of AI that has to go on top of what OpenAI does. So it's something that using ChatGPT strictly for gaining knowledge is not the answer at all.
Camille.
Yeah, I would agree with Robert. It depends on the purpose that you're using it for. I definitely would not use it for research, or if I did, I would just go back and double check on with other sources, whatever I learned. I think it can be very good for other kinds of things, like, write me 10 prompts, 10 questions to pose at a broadband breakfast on this topic. You can get a lot of great ideas and then go back and refine it. Also, the task of translating not only from one language to another, but from one register to another. So you can say, explain this to me as if I were in 6th grade. I could put in some dense medical language, notes from my doctor. And if I didn't quite understand it, I could put it in and have it kind of translated into a more lay language. So, with all the cautions around privacy, and be careful about what kind of information you're putting into these models in the first place, I think they have real possibilities for saving time, for helping to enhance our understanding of various parts of our lives. But I would be very hesitant to rely on it for research, especially because even if you ask for citations, it makes them up. So even if it looks very credible, if you go and actually look up, case law or a particular scientific article, they might not exist.
Adam.
Yeah, 3 quick points. First of all, let's remember, as we've talked about, we're still in the early days of large language models, and we're watching these things evolve in real time and getting real world experiments underway, and there's going to be a lot of trial and error, especially a lot of the error part of trial and error in these early days. But it's a learning process, and we do learn from error, and we evolve. And then this is my second point: we evolve into systems that usually get better over time technically, but also with a lot of human curation added to them. I mean, we had a lot of these same debates, Drew, you recall them, about Wikipedia when it first came around, right? I mean, I can't trust Wikipedia and all this. Well, that was human generated answers, and we still have questions about it. The reality is that I'm happy that we can utilize machine systems and human driven systems, and hopefully we get a hybrid of them that improves them all around. There's a wonderful new book out, and I'll just leave you with this, by two Harvard Business School scholars, Davenport and Miller, called Working with AI. And it's a case study driven analysis of something like 30 or 40 different sectors, where you're witnessing real-time machine learning and AI being utilized in traditional businesses and reinventing them in really interesting ways. And they talk about the best systems are the ones that evolve to have this sort of symbiotic relationship between humans and machines, like we've always seen, that are the best, where they improve each other, right? And we're going to get there. It's going to be a learning process with a lot of growing pains. It'll never be perfect. It'll be a constant, iterative process. But I'm confident there will be eventually be more wow moments as opposed to the embarrassing ones. So we'll get there.
Well, let's come, maybe this is our last topic before final thoughts, is this is another good question. Charles Baldwin asks that he references the SCIET, the organization at Georgetown, and says Helen Toner from CEST was on OpenAI's board. She and others on the board confronted Sam Altman on the rush to monetization, these are Charles' words, rather than prioritizing safeguards. Okay, and the kind of the breaking news from last night is that the old board that had 6 members minus the 2 Sam Altman and Brockman that were dismissed or demoted on Friday a week ago, those 4, 3 of those 4 are now gone, and the new board includes the individual from Quora, Adam D'Angelo, plus Brett Taylor, a former co-CEO of Salesforce, and Larry Summers. I mean, who'd have thunk, the former Treasury Secretary and former president of Harvard. But there clearly has been rumblings about like too fast or not fast enough. And OpenAI, of course, is a very curious organization that is a nonprofit that has a for-profit operating entity. So why or how does these conflicts around safeguards and kind of going too fast, accelerationists and decelerationist, why do these things have such currency in our debate around AI? And give that as an opportunity for everyone to offer thoughts on the future looking forward. Robert, let's hear from you first.
It's that's a difficult question. I think about whether going too fast or too slow. I think it goes back to this idea of, if we look in terms of development, we have to go fast on the development side, but somehow we have to become really good at somehow regulating, somehow using the tools we have now to take care of people that use it incorrectly, and that sort of thing. I wish I had a better answer for it, but I'm kind of torn between. I looked at that board. It kind of was a defeat for corporate governance, and that they, were originally put in place to make this a very safe and, well thought out kind of a rollout. But the minute they went, on going with the for public side and bringing Microsoft in and the 100 times cap on investment or whatever, it just almost seems inevitable. Like I don't really have an answer on how to stop it.
The profit motive is going to outstrip any nonprofit governance. That's kind of
and I don't have an answer to how not have that happen.
Camille, what are your thoughts on kind of going too fast or slowing down? How does this impact the general landscape of AI and generative AI?
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, they would go hand in hand. So I would ask that the safety protections and safeguards would accelerate at a pace equal to the technological innovations. I mean, they have to be completely integrated. And I think one thing that speaks to is the necessity of having diverse teams. So if you have people from different backgrounds and with different concerns who are on the development teams, then it's more likely that some of these concerns might be raised in the first place when it would be easier to correct for them than trying to go back afterward and repair whatever harm might have been done by them being developed in a way that prioritized, move fast and break things rather than trying to make sure that the products are actually going to be safe for the users.
I think that what really has driven this interest in what's happening with OpenAI this week is it's become a bit of a soap opera where we've seen an airing of dirty laundry out in public. I mean, it's like HBO mashed up Succession and their Silicon Valley show all in one, and gave it to us live, right, on Twitter to see. And I think a more mature board and a more mature, group of executives would have found a way to sit down and had a better discussion in private about all this before this all went public. And yet we've seen these types of things happen before. We saw it with Steve Jobs and Apple, and it's happened many, many other times. It's just this is happening in a more transparent media environment, a real-time one where everybody's got a say in a soapbox to stand on and sound off on what they think is happening. I mean, the number of, things that were circulated in the first 24 hours, it must be a sex scandal, it must be this, it must be that. Nobody had any information. They were just, hypotheticals like TMZ comes to tech policy, right? And so I still don't even feel comfortable commenting on it now because we don't have all the facts still. But that being said, the reason it was so interesting, I think, is because there was in the backdrop a little bit of a policy angle to this, or a philosophical one, about this sort of accelerationism versus decelerationism, right? And this is a battle for the heart of the future of Silicon Valley and the tech world. Maybe it isn't. I mean, I just reminded people, my only comment on this whole thing was that Sam Altman came to Washington in May, testified at hearings calling for comprehensive regulation and licensing to slow down AI, right? And then he was all of a sudden the darling of everybody in the accelerationist world. I mean, that didn't make any sense to me. It's just that Helen Toner and others on the board were more decelerationist and wanted to go even slower. And that is an interesting debate, right? That is the debate of our time about the future of AI and, who's going to govern it, how we're going to slow it down versus accelerate it. And it's particularly interesting, Drew, because we live in a world where, OpenAI isn't the only game in town, as I started by pointing out. There are so many other companies that are doing so many innovative things, and there's just so many other technological options and alternatives. I spend a bunch of my time defending open source AI and the whole world of alternative sort of mechanisms and methods of production for information technologies. That's what excites me most, is all of that little bottom-up sort of stuff that's happening in the world of AI policy. We should keep our eye on that ball more than this soap opera that's playing out in the valley between Sam Altman and his board.
Well, that will have to be our final word. We want to thank our panelists, Robert Clapperton, Camille Crittenden, and Adam Thayer, for being with us and sharing your thoughts. Don't miss next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time, where we're going to talk about the FCC's Digital Discrimination Order. And the week after that, don't miss Digital Infrastructure Investment Summit here in Washington. On behalf of all of our panelists and for each of you for joining us on this Thanksgiving weekend, thank you, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.